Well, welcome everybody this evening for our continuation of Get Out and Get Growing Part 2. And I want to follow on from last week, what we're talking about, expand it a little bit because this idea of producing some or all eventually of your own food may be something that you really do need to consider doing and getting going now more than perhaps you've been doing, simply because the time may come when, because things are expensive, things are not available, whatever has happened, that you might be dependent on what it is you can produce. Of course, I expect everybody on this call and should, or it does have food that's in storage. That's great, but we only have so much. And so it's the future food we're thinking about. Future food is what you can produce yourself. As I left off, last week we've been talking about the sustainability and a permaculture kind of a thing, and that you should be practicing those things now, learning how to do them now, making a lot of mistakes now. I've killed a lot of plants and I've had a bunch of failed harvests simply because I made mistakes and or timing and injury and a few other things. It just didn't go very well. Now's the time to practice and get better at it, and also develop a both personal practices and garden practices that are more resilient. And I mentioned that last week about the resilient gardener, and we're going to talk a little more about that. Very important. But it's about getting information. That's all that I can share with you is information. And I talk about books. And as I mentioned last week, I'll give you some of my book lists and some of the links and things after this class is done. If you want it, just drop me an email to my company address, and I'll have that at the end, and I'll send you what some of these things are. My library, and in fact, I've added new things to this. This is the nutrition production side of the library. And some of those books may be gone now, other because I replaced them. You find better books and you pass some of them on. This whole idea of knowledge, it breaks down into strategy, education, and instruction. And that's what we did in the previous course that we went through, is about the library. And it's this whole idea of gaining knowledge, spiritual attitude, knowledge, and then stuff. And this knowledge breaks down into information multiplied by experience. And within the knowledge part of it, particularly in the library, it's strategy, education, and instruction. And I told you one of the must have books. Now, there's a lot of options on books that you can have, but there's a few of them that I pick out and I say you really need to have them, and not just have the book. You need to read the book, study the book, go through the book, because just having it on your shelf doesn't do you any good. So one of these is you need to have Joel Salatin's Folks, This Ain't Normal. This is a big strategy book. This is a very important book for you to have. And I'd also recommend that you have this as an audio. The audio is read by the author, and it's really good to hear his passion, his interest, his commitment in this. So I really like the audio, but the book is the backup to the audio because you can still have it when the internet's gone and electricity doesn't work. One of the other books that you really must have that fits in with gardening, and that is the Human Ore Handbook. I'll talk more about that another time, but it comes out of your garden. You better be putting it back if you're going to be doing this over time. So the human ore composting is what we're talking about, and doing it properly with the human waste is extremely important, because you do it wrong, it's a real problem. So you've got to have the ability to take care of this waste properly so that you don't get hurt or sick. The Human Ore Handbook is the original one. It's outstanding. There's another one that Joseph wrote, which is the Compost Toilet Handbook. That's a good one there. It doesn't have quite as much technical information in the other one. It has a lot of really nice pictures in it, so it helps you get a feel for it. Now, I recommend that you buy the fourth edition. If right now you say, I just can't afford to buy the book, then go for the third edition, which is online as a free PDF. Just Google in the Human Ore Handbook. You'll find several places where you can get the third edition. The fourth edition has more than 50 additional pages, more information that's in it. Also, you want to have a printed copy, and if you download that 300-page PDF, the ink that it takes to print that on most of our printers is going to be more than it costs to buy the darn book. That's why I say buy the book. so that you have a hard copy of it. The other book that I mentioned that you must have is Carol Depp's The Resilient Gardener. Mentioned a little bit about that. And here again, we're saying this is a strategy book, this is an education book, this is an instruction book, one of those must-have books. And I did 12 interviews with Carol. I have more than 15 hours of audio. I will be publishing that audio. You'll be able to have that. And we're going to pick up a little segment here of some selected segments out of the first of the interviews that I did with her and get a little feel for her and what she says. Very delightful lady, very intelligent, PhD and a couple of PhDs. She's been a plant breeder and those kinds of things. And I want you to understand how it is she came about doing this, because this is a philosophy you need to understand. So in preparing your future, it's by having a resilient and sustainable food production system, a method of doing that. Very important that you're able to do that. Let's listen to Carol for just a moment here.
Welcoming to our broadcast, Carol Depp. Carol is the author of The Resilient Gardener. Let me tell you just a little bit about the book, which will tell you something about her. I'm always searching for books and other classes and things that I can recommend to people, things you'll want to have in your library. I was looking for some more of the garden books to see what I would recommend if there's anything new, and I came across, well, The Resilient Gardener. That was an interesting name. It caught my attention. The subtitle, Food Production and Self-Reliance in Uncertain Times, okay, that fits the things that we talk about and teach. But then the description below that is what then really got my attention. I said, I've got to get this book, go through the book, and see if it fits, and it does very well. And this is what it says: including the 5 crops you will need to survive and thrive: potatoes, corn, beans, squash, and eggs. What I'm familiar with and things I've taught and I listen to other people teach is what we sometimes call the 3 sisters. The Anasazi and Native Americans talked about them being corn, beans, and squash. And then when you add in the potatoes and the eggs, it certainly rounds that out. So that's what got me very interested in this book, and it's an absolute delight. And I've enjoyed the time I've had to visit with Carol. And this is not just a how-to garden book. This is much more than that. It's much more of the understanding of why you would do some of these things. It is, yes, about these crops. It's about how to utilize them, how to store them. And so it is just a treasure of information. But, Carol, when we were talking, you have kind of I'm going to call it the long view of things. Very often people are talking about all the terrible things that might be happening next week or next year, and it's difficult to predict those things. You have this 1,000-year view. Would you talk about that just for a moment? Because I think that is the best way to look at these kinds of things.
The 1,000-year view has got some real advantages. When you look at agriculture and just societies and the problems that they have historically over thousands of years, really, you see that different societies and different regions and different peoples always have their ups and downs. And we can be thinking in terms of being concerned about some particular problem that we can foresee coming up in the future, but our ability to guess what problems we're likely to face in our lifetimes, let alone the next century or so, tend to be not very good. It's hard to even understand why particular problems came up at particular points in the past, even with all the information that we've got after the fact. The one thing that we can be sure about is that hard times happen. Fortunately, good times happen too, but hard times happen, and they happen on all kinds of different scales. And one of the things that I noticed as I studied it and thought about it and read about various historical things that people have been through that have affected their agriculture is that a lot of the kinds of things that you can do to prepare for the smallest kinds of problems, the personal or family-sized problems that could interfere with your ability to support yourself or thrive or garden, if you can solve some of those problems, then a lot of times you've actually helped solve the problems for your family or for your neighborhood when it comes to even bigger disasters. I like the scale of 1,000 years because in 1,000 years, in the first place, you know that there are going to be ups and downs. In the second place, many of the kinds of ups and downs are things that you can avoid beating your breast about and pointing fingers of blame, because some of them we simply have no control over. Just as an example of one of the things that I frequently think in terms of, about 2 or 3 times per 1,000 years, the Pacific Northwest has a bigger than 9 Richter scale mega earthquake. And we're, roughly due for one of those any minute now or any century now. That's one of the nice things about thinking in terms of 1,000 years, is you don't really have to worry about anything all that much, because you may never see it in your lifetime. On the other hand, it's really useful knowing that every few hundred years, people in this area are going to have to go through that in my region, asking what would that actually do. And as somebody who's interested in gardening and agriculture, what kinds of things might I do and pass on to the people that I teach, so that if we knew those things, it would be easier to get through those times. And you can see that pretty much we wouldn't have any electricity, our roads would all be disrupted, the bridges would all be down, we would basically be cut off from the outside world for quite a while, and we would really need to be able to have a food supply that was as local as possible. That would help the situation a whole lot. Being able to have gardeners who knew how to garden without large imports of things from the outside, who knew how to save seed, who were doing it actively enough so that they had stored extra seed that they knew how to grow. I don't like to think in terms of disasters, but when you think in terms of 1,000 years, there's going to be some disasters in there. And you can see some of the kinds of problems that you'd have to face. Electricity being cut off from outside sources of seed and fertilizer, and having the roads disrupted, and so on. And with respect to what governments can do, an efficient government disaster program at best deals well with medium-sized disasters, because little bitty local disasters are too small for them to be concerned with. And major disasters simply are out of the range of public services and governments to deal with. In order to prepare properly for a Mega 9 earthquake, for example, our government would have to devote so much of its resources to that it would simply be uneconomical. So basically what happens when you've got mega disasters is, to a large extent, people are on their own resources for a while. So when I thought about it, that's a kind of extreme case. What about if we're completely on our own resources for a while? And you can see many other kinds of disruptions, say social disruptions, could have somewhat the same kind of effect. If your money system goes down the tubes, for example, you're cut off in a different kind of way, but again, you can't buy resources from the outside. So as a gardener, how would you deal with that situation? Well, turns out actually, if you simply have prepared for smaller types of personal emergencies, like the fact that you can lose your job or run out of money, if you have thought about your gardening in terms of how can I do this if I, for example, couldn't buy any fertilizer and couldn't buy any seeds, let me learn how to deal with that problem. Turns out exactly that kind of thing. How would I deal with the smallest, essentially least horrific bad times of the sort that individual people and families go through just all the time as a routine? If you can make your gardening and your garden more resilient towards those kind of small things, they would actually help with respect to the great big disasters too. If you've got a big supply of seeds, that means that if your community is cut off, you've got enough seeds to spread around to your neighbors so they can quickly convert all their front yards into corn patches and potato patches. That would help a whole lot. So that kind of overview of looking at things in terms of 1,000 years, focusing on the disasters that nobody really is to blame for, nobody really gets blamed for an earthquake, those present all the same kinds of problems as disasters that somebody really might be to blame for, like messing up the social system or the monetary system. But they are easier to think in terms of, because you can just say to yourself, okay, these things happen. What could I do to try to deal with the problem? Instead of sitting there and beating your breasts and saying, I've got to try to change the entire political system. But not all of us are good at that. I'm really good at gardening. And so, I could focus on that and say, okay, in the good times and the bad times, what kind of gardening can I do? I don't need good time gardening. What kind of gardening can I do that would really get me best through all of the kinds of problems like not having money, families losing their jobs and so forth, all the way up to the big disasters? And it turns out all those little things, solving the little problems, actually makes you a better gardener in good times, but it gives you much greater resilience in terms of your own family as well as your whole region in terms of really major bad times.
Well, let's contrast something here, because you use a term, it's in the book, and as we've talked about it, the good time gardens, or sometimes what I call the hobby garden, which is what most of us do. And then you have this term that you use, the resilient garden and the resilient gardener. And what do you mean by that? In fact, you went through, as I was reading the book, an event a few years back that kind of proved how a garden can kind of sustain itself or kind of go through times when you may not be able to apply all of the energy and skill and time to your garden, because now your life is enmeshed in some kind of an event.
Yeah, I actually came to think about resilience as a component of gardens and gardeners by having a very unresilient gardener and having a very unresilient garden at the time that I really needed to be the opposite. I was taking care of my mother for a decade while she was deteriorating from Alzheimer's, and this puts you under all kinds of stresses of various kinds, including, medical emergencies and times where there's just a month in which you don't even get to walk out to the backyard to water anything. My garden was set up so that I was getting the maximal production from my backyard garden bed system at the time, but if I didn't water it twice a week, it died. So I lost a lot of stuff where I would get out there and plant a whole bunch of stuff in one of the better periods, and then lo and behold, a month later, long before I got to harvest anything, there would be one of the bad periods, and by the time I would get back to the garden again, whole sections of it were complete waste for the year. So I basically started really thinking about the resilience of gardens and gardeners by doing it all wrong, basically, and then thinking about and having to learn during that experience what I needed to do to be able to garden when the garden's access to my labor was so unpredictable. The labor is a big component of resilience, and I think one thing that the hobby gardens, what I call the good time gardens, do is that they assume that basically everything is more or less okay, and life is going to more or less go on the way it has been going on, so that if you've got enough time to put the garden in, you'll have enough time to tend it, and you'll have enough time to harvest it. And the time component is one of the biggest parts of resilience, because by the time you get to the age that I've got to, you start realizing that things going the way you expect them to go is really pretty unusual. It's a lot more common for things to go wrong. So a big component, a big way in which I changed my gardening was I take into account the fact that the garden's access to my labor or anybody's labor is really very unpredictable, because life is basically unpredictable. And then I became a lot more interested in crops that didn't have to be irrigated at all, or if they had to be irrigated, it was only very limited irrigation and limited periods. And I started, instead of having beds that were so intensively planted, I started planting less intensively and in beds that were level to the ground, and in soil that I put more humus in, and I did more mulching, for example. A less intensively planted bed, you've got more resilience with respect to watering. And if you go to the extreme of giving the plants enough space and mulch them well enough, you might not have to water at all, meaning that at that extreme you end up with a garden that's basically going to go on and yield kind of whatever you do at that point after you plant it. there are space trade-offs, so I usually don't go to that extreme. I'm usually somewhere in the middle where I'm planting intensively enough so that given our northwest summers with no rain, I do have to water some, but I'm giving the plants enough space and good enough soil conditions so that if I just don't get to the garden for a month, the plants are still alive when I get back. They may not be very happy, but if I water them a little bit, they'll perk right up and do something for me. That's part of what I mean by a resilient garden. When I talk about a resilient gardener, I'm talking about a whole lot of things, but part of that is the way in which the garden contributes to your life and makes you a more resilient person, both with respect to your food supply and your personal health, but just also your emotional well-being. I was really shocked to find during that period when I was taking care of my mother that my unresilient gardening patterns actually, instead of maintaining my stability and quality of life, actually a lot of times they added to the pressure, because if I didn't get out to the garden and do a whole lot of stuff, I was going to lose the garden. I needed to garden in a way that I had the right amount of labor and nothing was going to go absolutely down the tubes that was irreparable if, in fact, I didn't get out to the garden at all. With respect to major disasters, gardeners who know how to garden with relatively minimal input and know how to save seeds are actually they're like a bank of information and seed that can contribute to the resilience of the whole region, really. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I encourage people who even don't have a whole lot of space to grow staple crops, for example, to at least do a little bit of it and learn how and have the seed, so that if they ever are in a situation, or if their children or those that they teach are the ones that are ever in that situation where their whole region is cut off, for example, that they have learned how to take a whole yard and convert it into corn, beans, and squash and potatoes if they had to, because they've done a little bit of it, and they know how to maintain the seed. They have a supply of seed tucked away in the freezer, enough seed not just for themselves but for their neighbors too. Gardeners like that are not just preparing for hard times for their own family, although they're doing that in spades, but they're also adding resilience to the entire community. And sometimes governments create all kinds of problems, as, for example, when the Soviet Union collectivized the farms, which all of a sudden became very unproductive, and it was basically gardeners that were producing all of the vegetables that were to be had were being done informally on tiny little plots of ground. That's the skill and the knowledge of gardeners. That's one thing I'm always conscious of, is that even people who are not going to grow large amounts of their own staples, I encourage them to at least learn how and do a little of it. But the kind of gardening that we need to know about is not really how to plant and grow things like lawns or ornamentals. We need to be able to grow food. That's what makes gardening a survival skill, being able to grow food, and not being able to grow food by seed and fertilizer and hire other people's labor, but how much food can you grow on as little labor as possible.
And the idea also is that it's not about just me being independent to take care of myself, but it's more of a community type of thinking, a community attitude, and being able to give and share and receive, and not just me and my garden and my household.
Even if you're in a situation where you can do gardening yourself, for example, if some disaster happened and you've got plenty of land, you've got plenty of seed, you've learned how to grow all that seed and can grow most of your staples and so forth and so on, are you going to sit there and watch your neighbors starve? Well, no. You really got to do something about your neighbors. And on top of that, even if you're a nasty person who was willing to let your neighbors starve, you wouldn't really be able to garden for very long, because they're not going to sit there and twiddle their thumbs and starve. Part of farming, any kind of agriculture, is something where your crop is sitting there in the ground and it's vulnerable. And so a basic law and order, rules, the idea that if you've planted that crop and that's your land, or you've made arrangements for the use of the land, that you get to harvest that crop. That only happens if there's a certain amount of affluence and possibilities for other people too. So you can either take care of your neighbors because you care about them, or you can take care of your neighbors because you'd better. That's kind of the way I look at it. And on top of it, I think that human beings are essentially social creatures. We succeed and we're happy when we're part of societies. And while it's fun to do a certain amount of stuff by ourselves, we humans always trade. We always have. We've been trading for hundreds, thousands of years. That's one of the basic characteristics, in fact.
Well, it becomes a part of maintaining social order when you're able to share and take, receive, so that you're now in a cooperative arrangement rather than one that is building walls. You're trying to assist each other, so it helps to keep the, I'll just say, some of that social order and things when it gets tough. As we move along, I want to talk about these crops for a moment, because that was one of the things I told you that got me interested in the book in particular. When I read corn, beans, squash, potatoes, and eggs, I said, okay, we're not talking about somebody that's, growing all the fluff. And by the way, it's really nice to have the other things, but you've got to get down to staples. You have to have things that maintain life. That's what the Anasazi did. That's why it was corn, beans, and squash, because you can get a huge amount of production out quite reliably, and those things will keep you alive. Might be boring after a while, but it'll keep you alive until you can come up with something else. Talk about why these 5 crops in your mind, and why do you talk about them, and you spend a lot of time in the book on them, not just about how to grow them, but use them and how to store them, because if you grow a bunch of it and you don't know how to use it, that's no good. If you grow a bunch of it and know how to use it, but you can't preserve it to get you through the winter, you've got a problem. So let's talk about these 5 crops for a moment and why these 5.
I think you get a taste of why I was so interested in her, both in the book and then also in the recordings. And the recordings, the interviews that I did with her, do not replace the book. They augment the book. And but the book stands alone, and the recordings would kind of stand alone too, but you really need both of them. So that's why I'm publishing them. They will be available. I'm going to start in next week with some of the edit, the cleanup, and getting them published as quickly as I can over the next month or so. I will get them up, but in the meantime, get the book is what I would recommend. You really do need that. Now, by the way, when I say these must-have books, that doesn't mean there aren't other books that you should have. There are a number of other books, and you may have a very favorite book in some of the gardening areas and the animal husbandry areas. That's great. But these, if you don't have these 3 books I talked about, you really should have them and be learning from them to augment whatever else you have. Well, one of the things that we have to face up to, particularly I'll say in the West for us, is the realities of what's happening with climate and weather and what's going on. And I just went and looked today to see the latest of the map on the drought situations. And of course, right after winter and into spring, it's better than it was in August and in September of last year. So it's improved a little bit. But if that's improvement, man, it's really ugly is the bottom line. You take a look at what the groundwater is doing, the shallow groundwater, and it's a real problem. We've got that. There's a few parts of the country, well, they're not in trouble that much, but we certainly are around here. And you've got to take that into account is the bottom line. And what you're going to do, how do you respond to this situation where we've got these reservoirs that are emptying out, and around here, the reservoirs that I see, there's no water in them. There's a little mud in the bottom, and that's about it. That is a big problem. And as it deepens, as the drought deepens, it's going to be more and more difficult for everyone. So we've got to take the pressure off our aquifers. And part of the write-up that I did on another class is that you've got to either get ahead of reducing the pressure on aquifers, or you're going to be forced into it, because there will be draconian laws that come into play and then it won't take into account who, how, when, and where. They just kind of blanket things that will occur. They're already occurring in California and some other places simply because we're running out of available water. Now, how long will that go? Don't know. Will it reverse? Hope so, but you can't count on it. So when you take a look at wells around here, taking a look at the groundwater watch, and these are all things you can look up online. I just grabbed some of these today to see where it is as of today. This map right here on the groundwater and on the wells, you can drill right in on individual states, and you can get right down to the county and to the city level on these wells. They really have it granular for you if you want to see what's going on. Of course, here in Utah, if you look at the map, yeah, we got some problems here, to say the least, and a lot of other areas do too. So we've got to be aware of that and compensate for that, so that we'll take the pressure off some of the wells and the aquifers, or we simply won't have any water. Sometimes the attitude of people is, well, I'm gonna get mine while I can so somebody else doesn't get it. We just can't think that way. We must not think that way, even though it's kind of natural human nature. One of the things that we can do about this is, I've mentioned this before, is take a look at the grass. What the heck is grass good for? Well, I had to analyze that for myself because I have a lot of grass around here. Why do I have it? Well, it keeps the mud down. It's a place where I'm building topsoil. It's a little cooler in the shade. It actually keeps the ground cooler, but it can be used for feeding some of the small animals. But one of the things you don't want to do going forward is not poison it. The herbicides, the pesticides and things, please don't put them on it, because that's a real problem in terms of the damage that it does to the microorganisms in the soil. The other thing is, the strategy is simply this: grass is extremely durable. Now, that grass you see in the picture there, which is looking out my backyard from my deck, there was no grass there when we moved here. It was mud. The spring, it was boot-sucking mud that was out there. And I just let the native grasses grow, and there's 5 or 6 different grasses in there of all kinds. And yeah, there's some things we call weeds, or dandelions, which, by the way, is food. And I just let it go, let everything go to seed for a few years, going to seed again and again and again. It grew itself. I didn't sod that. I didn't plant any seeds. They all showed up, because grass is one of the most resilient plants around, and how it has the rhizomes under the ground as well as the seed heads above. So let it go to seed, let it spread. And if it turns brown and dies off, if you give it some water, it will be back. It'll take it several years of extreme drought to really kill it off. And one of the things you're aiming to do is replace the grass with food crops. And when you do that, you put in drip irrigation. As I dig up the grass and plant things over it, which I've done, I showed that last week where I'm expanding my garden, that I'm going to use watering strategies that don't waste that water. It's going to be very, very targeted. So that's one of the things you must think about, is how do you target that? So it's reducing the water needs to the garden. And this is based on, in my case, this is what I based on. Well, I need to not spend very much money because I don't have a lot of money to pour into that. How to significantly reduce the water at the same time, and plan to use the water efficiently, reduce weeding burden, and to protect the soil. So one of the areas that you do that is you want to get the selective use of culinary water when I have to, or the secondary water. That's to put the water exactly where you need it. And I'll do more on that and these little devices that I built, that I'm going to water around my trees. The grass a little further out, let it die. But water right around the trees and concentrate that water there, because I only have so much. And the culinary water, I have to be careful with that. Even though I can run culinary water, it's darned expensive. It'll really motivate you to save water. The other things, of course, that people are kind of familiar with is the conventional drip irrigation, the ways you can do that, both subsoil and above. Those are kind of nice to do. But here again, you got to buy it, maintain it, take care of it. And some of them are kind of tender. Well, I have a whole bunch of scrap PVC pipe, and it's as crooked as a dog's hind leg, this stuff that was being thrown away, 1 inch and 1 1/4 inch out there. And I'll go through this in greater depth another time, but you can turn PVC pipe into a way of sort of drip. It's not really drip, but it's very spot irrigating, to where I can use my secondary water exactly where I want it. No fancy valves, no automatic or anything. It's very manual, where I go around and plug the hose in, but I can water my whole garden. It takes me about an hour to do it when I have the expanded garden to go around and water all these rows that are in there, but I'm putting the water right where it's needed. Something you'll hear about and read about in some places, the hugelkultur. This is good if you have more water. I'm in a desert. Hugelkultur doesn't work well for me here, where we don't have very much rainfall that comes throughout the spring, the summer, and the fall. Hugelkultur is digging a pit, putting a lot of wood in there, green wood, old decaying wood, branches and things, and then mounding up over it. That's the problem with traditionally doing it, is the mound up over it. Even though you add the mulch to it, it loses moisture too fast. I tried that. So I did a reverse of that by sinking it down in the ground. I dug a hole, and I have really hard ground. I dug a deep hole and then put down on the bottom that all the wood, the twigs, the branches, and the logs that I had that weren't really good, then put earth over top of that and leave it recessed. Now, this is a little bit of a pain because the ground is getting further and further away for me to get down to it, but it now protects it more from the wind and the sun, and it preserves the water a little bit better. So what you're wanting to do is get the water just to the spots where you need it. And I showed a little bit of this last year, and I'm going to redo this whole system again. I learned from it, and as I do it this next year, I'm going to put in the improvements that I did. But this is using the little trenches, the recess. It's a kind of modeled after that recessed bed that I experimented with first, to where the planting is done down in rows, but it's down low, and it's heavily mulched in there. This is not the weed cloth. This is plastic sheet. This is a 6 mil plastic sheet, so that any water that falls on it from the sprinklers or from the rain drains down into those ditches where the plants are in there. They're heavily mulched. And a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch up on the plastic on both sides of this row, it ends up putting 2 inches of water down right where the plants are. And the weeds over here, they don't get any water, and the soil doesn't get any water, and I don't want it to get it. I want it to be right on those plants where they belong. And then with my cheap throwaway pipe that I found, I can now water right in those rows on those plants. And it was a good experience last year. I'm going to do that again this year with some modifications to it that I'll explain as I do it, and I'll take pictures of it. But this was very successful for reducing water and weeding. Just eliminated the weeds. These are strips of plastic. They're 4 foot wide, and I'm going to make the rows 5 feet apart in here. Again, this is spreading out the plants so that they're not competing so much for water, because I have limited water, just like what you heard Carol was talking about there. So these are strategies that you can use, and you can find other things and other recommendations from other people, but you want to be practicing things, trying them to figure out what works for you. For me, this works very well. Back over here, this is where I've expanded more than double the size of my garden this last year. And what I have over there is mulch right in here. There's great value in putting in a cover crop when you're first expanding into an area, where I, turned in the grass, covered it with a cover crop. In this case, it was a mixture of a legume and beans, and I forget what the other thing was. Anyway, I put 3 different seeds in there and watered it fairly heavily, and then mulched the heck out of it so that I get some roots going down into that hard soil. And then that's all being turned in this spring, and so that I have organic matter in there, and I'll be expanding into that garden. Use of the mulch to keep the sun off the soil so it doesn't heat as much, to maintain the moisture down in there, the moisture for the plant. So you'll want to learn about doing that. Then another thing, because you're trying to keep the moisture down in the ground around the plants, we'll do a little bit with biochar, and I'll show you that. It's easy to make, that you produce this biochar if you have the woods. Biochar is just charcoal, is what it is. And this down inside of this is the retort down in here where I make the charcoal, the biochar, and then it's going to go in the soil. It'll be broken up and screened, and I use it a couple of different ways. I'll show you some tricks that I'm learning with it that are really nice. And all these little, this is looking at some of the charcoal right here, all these little pivots and cavities and holes in it that will both hold moisture, but it'll also hold organic matter and some of the nutrients that you want to be in there. It'll hold them and then release them to the plants, but it's really good at holding moisture. Now, you can buy vermiculite and perlite to do that, but the key word there is buy. This I can make for no cost once I have my retort, which can be recycled drums. So you can learn to do some things like that that'll help you with your water usage and help the health of your garden. We have an awful lot of throwaway water around here. And a house that I consulted on, that one on the right over there, I did a lot of things there, the solar work and the energy systems in it, the water recovery and everything, including a metal roof. And when I re-roof my house in the next 2 or 3 years, I'm going to have to do that because this roof is now 20 years old, 21 years old, and it's getting a little ragged in a few places. Please put on a metal roof. These architectural metal roofs, the turn pan, the standing seam ridges, whatever you want to call them, they go by various names because it will shed the water and the snow. Then get your rain gutters up there so you can gather it. And if you need rain barrels, well, you can get some cheap little things here. And there is a class, by the way, online in there. It's about harvesting this throwaway water that we have. So it's in the water section in the library on jimsway.com. I did a whole class on that where we talked about these things and some of the cisterns and things that you may want to do. So consider doing that, particularly for the spring melt of the snow that's on the roof. That's when we get most of our water. The other thing is you want to think about recovering wastewater. There's a lot of wastewater that we have in the house. It shouldn't be waste. It's actually a resource. Now, there's a couple of key words here. One of them is black water. That's in the toilet. Get rid of it. Well, actually, you need to get rid of the toilet too and go to composting. That's why you got that book up there, and you get rid of that flush that uses so darn much water, and you'll use that as a resource. So do it right. Get that book. Start practicing it. I'm building one of those composting systems right now. I'll give you some pictures, but you don't have to wait for me. Go get the book and just simply do it. So black water you do not want to keep. You want to not flush it, but compost it. Gray water, plants go berserk for this stuff. Gray water, bathtubs, sinks, washing machines, and things like that. And most of the water in our house that we're consuming is used for, I'll say, sanitation, washing needs, and it's just thrown away, most of it being flushed down the toilet. Now, if you take a look, and these are some average numbers that are gathered, you can get all this online from the EPA. Per person, about 117 gallons a day. Per household, around 300 gallons a day, unless you have, well, 9 kids like we did. And that was obviously a lot higher than that. Getting rid of the flush toilet will actually save quite a bit of water by not consuming the water to flush away, half a pint of pee and a little bit of poop down there. What a waste of water to do that. So learn to compost it. Clothes washing and dishwashing, how much we use. You look at that list right there. And one that's very significant on the average is leakage. Little leaky faucets, the toilet tank that needs to refill periodically because you're leaking. A lot of water is wasted in leakage around the house. So if you take a look at that water, the clothes washer and the dishwashers and the bathing and the faucets and some other miscellaneous activities where you have water that you can save, that is wonderful. So you look for ways of recovering it. This is not the class on that. I'll talk about it at another time, but you can go online and look up about that. I experimented with saving some of this water, and so that I could experiment with it. We put a bucket underneath the sink and drained all the water into that, and I was taking it out and putting it in a barrel and draining it down to the garden. You can do that. That's a lot of work. You do that for a little while, and you're going to figure out, I want to change my plumbing, chop some holes in the wall or whatever it is. And it might come down to that. In fact, that's what I have to do. I'm going to have to poke some holes in walls and go to the outside. But water is so precious, and I can see the handwriting on the wall. I better get ahead of the curve and do it. So if you take a look at this, what you can potentially save, maybe 50, 60% of the water could be used, repurposed for fruit trees, berry trees. Maybe you don't want to put it on your garden, but I'll tell you what, fruit trees, shade trees, and berry bushes, they will go nuts over that. They get water with a lot of organics in it, and they will love it. I've done that for years at other houses, and you just watch these plants just grow explosively. And that's all water that you are going to have to use, either your secondary irrigation water or culinary water that you shouldn't be spending money on getting. You want to expand the growing season. We'd all like to have big old greenhouses. This would be nice. Don't have one. They're wonderful in the winter, particularly if they're attached to greenhouse. You'd really love to have them. But do what you can do. The cold frames. This is a very simple thing to learn about. These are just boxes. Maybe they're insulated, maybe not, just with the windows on them so you can trap a little bit of that sunlight in there. You got an old sliding glass door or a French door with glass in it or window panes. This is the way to use it. Will it make it all the way through the winter? Well, it depends on your season. You can also learn about having what are called hot frames, where you bury down in there some really hot fertilizer like chicken and fresh horse and cow manure down under the plants, down deep, and cover that with the soil the plants are going to grow in. And as that stuff cooks away, it produces heat underneath this box and it keeps it warmer. This one right here, you can see all the snow that's around it and the cold that's there. And then when you open that section that's right to them under his left hand right there, that's what's in there, all these nice greens, the cool weather kinds of things. So this is all stuff you can do that will help you grow more, produce more, and do it longer so that you do not have to be dependent on always using your food storage or going down and buying really expensive stuff, or you can't afford the expensive stuff, so you buy junk. You need to get out and get growing more and more. One of the things that we talk about, and even Carol Depp in that segment I played for you, she mentioned this. It's about community. It's about our neighbors. We're in this together. We need to work together and help each other. And yes, you may have to protect some of your stuff, but then you look for people that can help you. You help them, and they can help you. Online on Jim's Way, there's a class in there. It's in the members only in there. It's we're all in this together. And literally, we're going to either thrive as a community or we're likely to die in isolation. Now, again, that I gave you last week, the same thing, that your food supply infrastructure will not be a threat to you if you lose it, if first, you're fully committed to a self-reliant living. You're practicing those things now. You're learning it. You're getting better and better and better. Every day, every week, every month, you're doing a little more. You're gaining the knowledge, the understanding, because that's not optional. You have to know this stuff, know how to do it. You only know how to do it by practicing, playing with it, and making a lot of mistakes. You also have knowledge of the proper tools and how to maintain them and take care of them. You've stored sufficient food to get you through until you are producing in your tribe, your neighborhood, you're producing 100% of what you need, if that's where it breaks down to and goes. You're going to have enough food in storage to get you there. 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it is, you need to have it. And then because you've got a learning curve and a practice curve, you're also going to have crop failures, late frosts, early frosts, what have you, that takes things out. You've got to have food in storage to take care of that. And of course, you'll be replenishing your food storage. You are a part of a community. You're working together, you're sharing things together, you're coordinating things together, and you have the ability to find and create needed resources, again, as a community, because not everybody knows everything and can do everything. And then you live the personal survival beatitudes. That's in another class. The personal beatitudes are very, very important to learn those. I have some of those online. And that you currently produce more than is practical. It's frankly not practical to be growing very much in the standpoint of your time and wages and all these kinds of stuff. And it's a whole lot of work and it's painful and everything. It may not be practical, but it makes a whole lot of sense getting ready for the future. And you're going to be ahead of the curve when things break down. So live those laws, those thinkings, those principles that I'm sharing with you. Well, here again, you go to jimsway.com. If you haven't been there, there's a place to register for the newsletter. Also, there's links to a lot of things on there. I have links, and I'm adding in more links to things that I've already published elsewhere. Some of them are on other websites, and some of them, of course, are links to YouTube and places like that. So I encourage you to do that. And as I said, I'll be getting these Carol Depp programs up for the next few weeks because I'm highly motivated to do that, because I know how important they are to learn what she talks about and getting a feeling for it to add in with all the other things you're already doing. Well, we're in this we're about an hour right now, not quite. So we'll take some questions here. Again, if you want to get the Get Out and Get Growing, the book list and the links that I gave you before, plus more, now that we finish this class, I'll send that to you. You'll be able to get it on by sending an email to jimswayworks@gmail.com. That's my email for the company. And just say that you want to get out and get growing, book lists and links, or just whatever the handout is, and I'll send it to you. Questions that you may have, comments that you've got, we'll do that for a few minutes, and then we'll go away for this evening. And maybe you want to get out and do some gardening tonight.
When you're first getting started, the ground is, I'll just use the word hard.
Yeah.
Any particular tricks for starting to break it up, loosen it up? I mean, you can get big power machines and whatever, but is there some simple way to go about it without killing yourself with manual labor?
Well, I'll just say it depends on your budget. If you have the budget to, I'll say, hire somebody to come in with the rototiller and the scrapers, if it's really, really hard ground, you may literally need to come in there on, like, if you have ground like this where my grass is, this stuff is it's the Kmart parking lot hard. I mean, it is really hard when it gets dried out. Now, part of it is you can dampen it up a little bit. That'll usually make it a little softer. But you can have somebody come in with a bobcat, bulldozer, or something like that to break it up, and then you can till it and those things. If you're having to do it yourself because you don't have the budget to hire the equipment to come in and do that, then it is backbreaking labor, and you're going to turn that over. If you know, this stuff is so hard that a traditional tiller with the bolo tines on it will not cut through it. Now, what I have that will in fact cut through this stuff, even though it's small, is I have one of the Manus tillers, and it'll chew through that, but it's a lot of work. So you're going to do it in patches, in spots. And here, this section right in here, what I did was, one of the things that you can do is you can wet that soil down, and then if you have tarps that you can put over it, big heavy tarps, put over it, and let it kill out the grass for a whole year. Just cover it, let it kill the weeds in the grass, and then you can go to it. In my case, I didn't have time to do that. I just took and we tilled it as best we could, and then I added to it the seeds that I put on it for the cover crop. This is it right here. After we broke that up, and I mulched it real heavily, and I just started watering it. And what I have in there is I have mung bean, alfalfa, and a pea in there. And the reason I'm using the mung beans and the peas is that they are legumes. They help to fix nitrogen in the soil and to break up the soil. And actually, I have a pretty nice green mat out there. I didn't take a picture of it, but it's a really nice green mat. The soil is still pretty darn hard, but those roots are starting to penetrate down in there. One of the problems with grass is its rhizomes that makes this mat that's pretty close to the surface. It's really quite stiff and it's packed in there hard. By putting in there the alfalfa, which has a deep root, and also the peas that I put in there and the mung bean, they actually have a fairly deep root, so they'll begin to penetrate down in there. Even though that ground is really hard, they'll work in there a little ways. Over years, what you're trying to do is get a lot of organic material into it. And you're going to compost the daylights out of that thing. And that's what I'm doing. I showed pictures this last time of all my compost bins. I don't think I have any here, where I'm making just literally yards and yards, cubic yards of compost that I'm doing all the time. Everything I lay my hands on, people that throw away leaves and things like that, branches, all the kitchen scraps, and some of the paper, cardboard, and what have you, goes in there because I've got to make as much compost as I can. And I take and the grass that we, when we tilled this up and chewed it up, we raked up all the clumps of grass. They all go into the compost over there, and I turn them into organic matter too. So, and I get a lot of wood chips and things like that. There's not an easy way to do it. You're going to get a garden fork to get in it. My soil is very rocky, and that's one of the things I keep doing is gathering rocks. I've had piles and piles of rocks, small rocks, little rocks. It's just a lot of work, and you got to go to it. And that is an area there that is roughly 30 feet by 30 feet, if I remember right, that I've expanded into. And I'll just keep going at it and working the organic material into it. So if you got money, hire somebody to do it. If you don't, it's a lot of work. That's the bottom line.
You triggered a question in your answer there. How much land do you need per person to have enough food?
Well,
that might be a hard question, but I think you got the gist of it.
It is. Well, and here again, it depends on what is the quality of the soil and how much water do you have. If you can grow very intensively in the, I'll just say the raised beds, if you have a lot of water to do that, and you have very rich soil that you have lots of nutrients in it, you can grow a tremendous amount of produce in, in a 30 foot by 30 foot. In fact, I see people writing about you can grow enough for a family of 4 under a quarter of an acre. Now I have an acre, and so theoretically you could do that, but that's pretty intensive growing. So I'm expanding beyond what's going to be that quarter of an acre. I've got to do that because this soil is not that great. Over in my producing garden, and I have 3 areas that are doing that. I don't show pictures of them here. I'll do that another time. The soil is pretty darn good in here. I've been working on this soil for 17 years, and the soil is pretty good, although it's still pretty darn hard under these humps, but it grows quite well. This section does, all the ones over in here, and here you can see these 2 areas right here. They are 40 by 30s, and they actually produce quite well if I get the water on them. And then I'm adding the compost every year. And I have lots of straw that I'm working in. Again, the carbon matter is what you want in there, and then making the biochar. So there's books that are written on that. If you want to go online and you can look at different people that have done things, but I'll just tell you, it depends on how much water do you have and how good is that soil. I do not use any commercial fertilizers. You may want to have some in storage because if you're trying to jumpstart things and you're converting your front lawn into growing, you may have to get some, I'll just say some commercial fertilizer on it to start with. They'll always be short of the trace minerals. So you get things like azomite and some of these others to get some of the trace minerals in there that you need, and then just compost the daylights out of it. So I'd say look up online because it depends. I figure I'm going to have under cultivation as quick as I can get it. I want to have half of my yard is cultivated. That'll include the fruit trees that I have, berry bushes, and then the I'll say the vegetable part of it. And the other thing we haven't talked about is you're really going to want to either yourself have or a neighbor that has, I'll say, the animals. The easiest animal for most people to have in our area will be the chickens. You've got the eggs, and then you've got potentially the meat. And if you learn how to do it, that can be a self-sustaining crop of animals. Rabbits is another one to have, although they don't produce much fat, so you're going to have something else to supplement that. And then you look at, goats and cows and things, but that's pretty tough for most people. Chickens is what I've done, and I've had good success with them. They're useful both in the garden and in the yard to keep some of the bugs down.
Next question. The little bit of stuff I've done, once you harvest it, it's a ton of work to take care of that. Any comments in general about that?
We actually do a variety of things. Bottle some things, can them. That usually takes a fair amount of work. I actually probably mostly dehydrate because dehydration can be pretty quick to do that. Also freeze things. Of course, use the fresh things, but dehydrate, freeze, and can. And it just kind of depends on how much I have of what. Now, one thing that I had, and I showed some pictures this last time, is my beet harvest and my carrot harvest. Well, that was easy to take care of because you just leave it in the ground. And then you harvest them through the winter. And then in the spring, I harvested the last of my beets this spring. And one of the things that's nice about beets and carrots is if you have an extra refrigerator, which I do in the garage, and I just turn that into produce storage, and beets will store for, I've had some beets in there that I'm using. They were 4 months old, getting to be 5 months old. They're still just fine. and store them in there. And of course, they'll overwinter in the garage and things like that. We'll talk about that at another time. So some of them, particularly the root crops, you don't have to harvest all of them and use them. You can harvest as you go through the winter, go out there and dig them if you've protected them properly. And then some of the other things, the greens and what have you, dry them, freeze them. My kale, I chopped up a whole bunch of kale. I didn't know how this would work, and I didn't have time to do anything. The dehydrator was full. I just took and chopped it up into chunks, threw it into big freezer bags, and tossed it in the freezers. And I've been getting that out and putting it in soups and stews and things like that as I'm cooking. So some of it you don't have to do a lot. I know you're supposed to blanch and do that. I don't have time to do some of those things. What I need to do is not have it rot. So I just chop it up, throw it in a bag in the freezer. It may not be the way you're supposed to do it, but it works just fine. Don't have any problem with it. And of course, if you have the resources, one of the things I would like to have would be a freeze dryer. I have neighbors around me that have them, and they're freeze drying things all the time. But that's not on my list. I have the air dehydrator. I hope that gives you some, I'll say, a little bit of comfort. And the bottom line is, it is a lot of work that you're going to be tied into spending some time and energy. And when you're doing the harvesting and trying to preserve things for a period of time, it's heavy work. But then come November, December, January, you're just eating that food and you're not having to work in the garden. So it kind of pays for itself that way. I thank you for showing up next week. And for those of you that tuned in later, next week will be on the solar that I've been playing with and building up for a friend of mine. And also that I got to use it today, the storage part of it, when the power was off and I'm trying to get this program ready and everything goes dark. And after a half hour, 45 minutes, it was like, oh, golly, this may be one of those long ones. I need to finish this program so that I can be on here. So I drug it downstairs. I got the battery inverter controller system down to my office, ran extension cord in, plugged in my computers and all. And by the way, we're probably more than 7 hours running on it now. And I knew that if the power didn't come back to power up the Wi-Fi and those things, that I would just drag an extension cord over there and plug it in, and we could broadcast with the power being off, because the phone company usually don't lose the internet unless it's something really big and widespread. But so I could have broadcast tonight on backup power, and that's what we're running on right now. So we'll be talking about that next week. For 2 weeks, I'll be doing that. It could always expand into 3, because you can, there's really a lot that can be said, but I'm not going to try and teach the granular part of that. What I want to do is keep you out of trouble, because there's a lot of good information that's online, but some of it, you've got to know how to interpret it, how to believe it, and be careful of what people are trying to sell you. But there's some good instructions on making your own systems if you want to, or know when you're going to spend $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 for something, what it will do, what it won't do. It's been a real blessing to have this little system here, because we're operating tonight because we got it. And my voice is about done. So I'll say good night, and I'll see you Saturday. Come with more questions and what have you, and I'll have my pictures available. We can talk about some of these things in greater depth. Have yourself a good evening. I will see you Saturday and next Wednesday. Good night.